Welcome to Wrapped Up Wednesdays.
Hey, what's going on, YT? It is your boy Diego, but you can call me Chancho or Chanch or Chench, whatever floats your boat. And today we have a very special guest joining us on this new series called Wrapped Up. And you can recognize her. She is my wife. She's played my wife. She's played my daughter, and she's been the camera woman too. It is Ashley. Welcome to episode 1 of Wrapped Up. And what is Wrapped Up, you may be asking yourself? Well, you better stick around and find out. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. This is a little bit different than what we usually do. We usually do parodies and skits, funny videos, but we're both super into true crime, so we thought we would delve into it. And why did we choose to delve into it?
So we chose to call this series Wrapped Up because we wanted to be comfortable, cozy while we tell you the stories. We also encourage you guys to grab your favorite snack and favorite blankie and join us. So we chose to do the series because Diego invested in these awesome, cool mics and this green screen behind us. And we were like, yo, we have to use this, right? So we were like, what do we like to do?
Well, we were both inspired. We love listening to podcasters like Crime Junkies with Ashley Flowers and Britt. And we also like listening to Bailey Sarian on, what's the show?
So her series is
Mystery and Makeup Mondays.
Woo!
Right.
We love her.
It's getting hot.
I know. It's getting juicy.
So you're probably wondering what today's video is going to be on. Well, Ashley, care to explain here?
Yes. So we are going to be talking about a true crime that unfortunately not a lot of people have heard about, but it's the Chris Benoit story that happened in 2007.
Chris Benoit.
Very
That's right,
weird
Benoit.
spelling and pronunciation. I don't know.
So we chose to call this new series Wrapped Up because we're going to delve into cases that have already been solved. This isn't going to be one of those channels or podcasts maybe where they're like, oh, and to this day, we do not know who committed this crime. We're going to delve into stories that have been wrapped up. And so we got wrapped up in our blankets. And yeah, these cases are all wrapped up. And so the inspiration for today's video was I was chilling on YouTube one day, as I usually do, and I was scrolling and I came across a thumbnail with a picture of Chris Benoit, and it said, Family Annihilator?
The tea is hot today.
And I was like, that can't be right. What did I squeak? I don't know. I was like, that can't be right. Chris Benoit, he's a WWE wrestler. What do you mean he killed his family? Then I looked it up on the internet, and in 2007, he indeed killed his family. And yeah, this is crazy to me because as I was growing up, I was super into the WWE.
What years were you into the WWE?
Like 2004 to like 2010. So yeah, like right in the middle is when this happened.
So your favorite wrestlers were?
I would say my favorite wrestler was Triple H and Shawn Michaels. And I don't know if you guys remember, but they would be like, D-Generation.
Yeah, we got in trouble for doing the signature.
We're not going to say what they used to say because I don't want to get copyright stricken. But yeah, we were super into the WWE. I used to play WWE with my friends on the trampoline. One time I almost killed one of them, but that's a story for another day.
Or maybe not. I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe we'll talk about. Well, long story short, I was John Cena, and I did his signature move that I don't want to say because it also is a bad word. But I threw him off the trampoline, and then he got kind of injured. I thought he was dead.
But he lived.
So, Ashley, is this a good time for a disclaimer?
Yes, it is. So, viewer discretion is advised, guys. So, we are going to be talking about abuse, substance abuse, alcoholic abuse, murder, suicide, and also, unfortunately, the murder of a child. So, if you guys do not want to hear this, if true crime is just not for you, then hey, we've got other videos. Check them out.
Yeah, we have funny videos that you can laugh at. You don't have to watch the serious stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we'll add the link.
No pressure.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and get into the exposition. Ashley, would you like to start us off?
Chapter 1, Exposition. Chris Michael Benoit, born May 21st, 1967 in Montreal, Canada, born to Michael and
Canadian.
and Margaret Benoit, was raised in Edmonton, Alberta. Now, from what we know, when he was 6 years old, he was involved in a serious car accident.
He banged his head.
Yeah, he injured his head. I don't really know the severity of it.
It doesn't really play that much into the story, but we can start seeing his head starts getting messed up at the age of 6.
Yeah,
so that plays an important part later.
Keep that in mind, guys. So we don't really know much about, his childhood growing up because not much was written on it, but we do know that he was athletic. So at the tender age of 12, his father took him to the Edmonton Pavilion where he saw his soon-to-be idol, Dynamite Kid, wrestling. Guys, 12. Can you imagine that? He soon began to wrestle, not professionally, in his
Just
backyard.
In the backyard.
Just like we all do. Exactly. And he started idolizing Dynamite Kid and using his moves, for instance, his signature, which is the flying headbutt and also the snap suplex.
This is what the headbutt used to look like.
But more aggressively, of course.
Off the ropes.
Off the ropes.
Not that gentle.
Right. Aside from Dynamite Kid, he also was a fan of Bret Hart. But of course, not as much as Dynamite Kid, because when he was still like an amateur, he was going by Dynamite Chris. So that should just tell you who was number one, basically. So as we mentioned, he also idolized Bret Hart, which he then went on to wrestle in his father's gym called the Dungeon. It was there that he graduated, and after that is when he decided to professionally start his career at the age of 18 and start wrestling in Japan, where he then met another famous wrestler called Eddie Guerrero. Now, the reason why we're going to say Guerrero is because
we roll our R's on this channel.
Yes, we're not going to say Guerrero because that's just not how you say it.
Anyways, go on.
Anyways, so he ends up meeting Eddie Guerrero there, and it said that they were basically rivals.
At first, they didn't like each other.
Yeah, just couldn't. And the reason why is because they wrestled similar and they always had a leg up on one another. Like, there was never a time where, like, one came out victorious, like, by a long shot. It was always, like, they had to fight to get that win. But eventually, they became besties, and I think that's great because it's, like, rivals to friends. Love it. We're here for it.
So in Japan, Chris Benoit was wrestling under the stage name of Pegasus Kid or Wild Pegasus.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know why.
It doesn't really scream like... Rah.
Nah, it's not like a cool wrestling name. But I mean, the 80s were a different time.
They were different.
And Eddie Guerrero at that time in Japan was going by the stage name Black Tiger.
Actually does...
I like Black Tiger. It's all right.
It's pretty intimidating.
9.6.
It was there that they also happened to wrestle wrestle against another young wrestler called Chris Jericho,
who you may know to this day. I mean, I don't know how much you guys know about wrestling, but that name, he actually still wrestles. We looked that up.
Yeah,
and he's like 50. So it's like, dang, man, at 50, I'm out, retired. My knee's already bad as it is.
But Chris Jericho actually states that Chris Benoit was one of his inspirations to get him to start wrestling.
That's right.
So when he first came to Japan, his stage name was Lionheart because he was just so inspired by Eddie and by Chris.
And they both had animal names, so he decided to take on an animal name too.
Yeah.
So Lionheart was Chris Jericho's. If you're taking notes, write those down.
Yes, please do. So after wrestling for 13 years in Japan, Chris Benoit, by himself, decides that, hey, you know what? I think it's time for me to go to the States and wrestle.
Time for the big leagues.
Time for the big leagues. Exactly.
So he goes to the WCW in America, the World Championship Wrestling.
Correct, yes. And he was only there for 1 year, from 1992 to 1993. And it was at the WCW where he decided... before we were born. Holy cow. But it was...
And that's because of World.
Well... I don't know. But it was at the WCW where he teams up with Biff Wellington.
Biff Wellington.
First, when I
what
think
a name.
Wellington,
Beef
I think
Wellington.
of...
I think that he's making a pun on his... But he tag teamed with another Canadian wrestler, Biff Wellington.
I don't think that was an accident.
In 1994, he would then join the ECW, which is the Extreme Championship Wrestling, and that's where he became known as Crippler Benoit.
Crippler Benoit. Or just Crippler by itself.
Crippler. He started getting that nickname.
To be honest, that sounds a little bit more intimidating than...
The Crippler? I don't know.
Than Pegasus Kid.
Hey, man.
No.
All right, next.
But it was there that he would also meet a fellow wrestler called Dean Malenko.
Malenko.
He's also important to the story, so keep that in mind, guys. So it was there that they became besties. And then in 1995 through 2000, Chris
Benoit, not Jericho.
Right. Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, and Dean Malenko would all join the WCW. But remember, this is Chris's second time, while this is Eddie and Dean's first time. So 3 besties, wrestling together. What could go wrong?
Taking on the world.
Exactly.
And while he was at WCW for his second time, this is where he would be introduced to Kevin Sullivan. Write that one down because he is very important in the story.
So important.
Write that down.
Write it down. So Chris Sullivan was actually another fellow wrestler. Kevin Sullivan was another fellow wrestler.
Looks like you didn't take your notes.
How dare you? Let me get through the script.
Go ahead.
Kevin Sullivan was also another fellow wrestler and also a booker. Keep that in mind. That is so important.
If this coffee wasn't cold, I would drink some.
So he was actually in charge, Kevin was in charge of scheduling fights, creating storylines, you name it. Mm-hmm. So at the time of WCW, he was actually in a storyline that had him feuding with the 4 Horsemen.
By the way, guys, if you guys don't know, the WWE and all this stuff is like scripted. It's just a show.
Yeah, unfortunately.
I remember finding out for the first time and just being heartbroken.
So shell-shocked. I was
but, I mean, you can kind of tell because the hits are very like, come on, man.
Right,
but it's just entertainment. So they like write storylines and they write feuds for you to be entertained with. But I mean, whatever. It's just a show. So
it's just a show. Whatever.
Yeah.
So at the time, Kevin Sullivan was in a storyline that had him feuding with the 4 Horsemen, right? However, in real life, he was in a real feud with one of the members from the 4 Horsemen called Brian Pillman. So because they were feuding in real life, Brian was like, you know what? I've had enough.
I'm done.
I'm out. So he leaves the WCW and goes to their competitor, WWF.
Scandal? Again, if this wasn't cold, I would drink it.
Well, I'm still going to drink it because the tea is hot. Give me a moment to recover.
That was a deep gulp, man.
I know.
This isn't an ASMR channel.
So because Brian left, Kevin is like scrambling. He's like, what do I do now? If I had a light bulb, he notices that Chris Benoit was like in an alliance with the 4 Horsemen. And he's like, you know what? You're my target. So he grabs him. Well, not physically grabs him, but he just like pulls him aside. And
snatches him away.
He's like, hey, Brian left. He dipped. So I need you to be his replacement. So now you and I'm going to create a storyline where we are feuding. And in that storyline, I'm going to have my on-air valet have like an affair with you guys, right? And Chris at first was like, all right, whatever, like I want screen time. If I gotta do it, I'm gonna do it because like I need to be known in the business, right? So then Kevin creates this affair that involves Chris Benoit and Kevin's real life wife, Nancy.
And she is extremely important in this story.
It's
so write that down.
Real. But before we get into her story, we just want to point out that Chris was married to his first wife named Martina.
And they had a son. What was his name?
They had 2 sons, actually. Two kids.
Oops.
The first was Daniel and the second was Megan. Now, it's not super important like the kids, but it is important to know that he was married before and he had kids before, right? So why don't we go ahead and dive into Nancy's story? So Nancy Sullivan, I guess we'll call her that.
Sullivan for now.
She was born in May 17th, 1964 in Boston, Massachusetts. Again, not much is known about Nancy in her early life, but we do know that she was married 3 times. So from 1981 to 1985, Nancy was married to her first husband named Jim, before she began her wrestling career, of course. In 1985, Nancy met Kevin Sullivan. I told you that name would be important. Mm-hmm. She met him at a modeling job, and Kevin just needed her.
He was like, ooh, a baddie?
A baddie? In the 80s? Ooh!
So then he snatched her up.
He snatched her up. He was like, you are working for me.
You are with me now.
Yeah, like, forget Jim. Forget him. You're mine now, basically, right?
So Nancy's role was to basically become an on-air valet to him in his wrestling matches. You know those girls, they don't exist anymore.
Thank
but
God.
back in the olden times, the guy wrestlers would like bring a valet or like a girl to like basically like do all the trash talking on the side as they were wrestling, like, you don't even
They were the worst. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and they would like secretly like sneak in weapons for their male
Chairs,
wrestlers. Here's this
hammers, you name it. And
so she was essentially the person that created that role in the whatever wrestling league they were. WCW.
Yeah,
Sorry.
and she became an icon. Like, she was one of the first ladies that made that role famous, that made other women be like, yo, if I can come out and get screen time and just look pretty and like help my teammate win, sign me up. So she did, right? And so shortly after joining Kevin's entourage, that is where Nancy divorces her husband, Jim. And what would you know? She marries Kevin in 1985. Now, listen, I know your coffee is cold, but we got to take a sip. Because she was married to her first husband in 1985. She's still married to him. She joins Kevin's entourage, and within that same year, she divorces her husband and marries her second husband. She marries Kevin in 1985, and next thing you know, they become this power couple in the wrestling world. And let me tell you something, power couples, whoa, do not mess with them. From 1989 through 1990, Nancy and Kevin would join the WCW. And it was there that Nancy would gain her stage name called Woman.
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 Just Woman, that's
Just
it.
Woman, exactly. And she also became a manager to several wrestlers. And that was kind of like their role. Not only be on-air valets, but also be managers to the wrestlers, which I think is pretty cool. In 1993, Nancy and Kevin would then join the ECW, which is called Extreme Championship Wrestling. There you go. Sorry. But shortly after, Kevin would leave the company, but Nancy was like, listen, you bow out, but I'm going to still stick around. So she stayed around until 1996. From 1996 to 1997, Nancy and Kevin made their second appearance in the WCW. This is where the puzzle starts clicking, you know, because you're probably wondering, like, where is this going? We're getting there. This is where Nancy and Chris would first come into contact at the WCW.
Benoit.
Chris Benoit, exactly.
Not Jericho.
Right.
There's a lot of Chris's.
There is so many Chris's, so please be on your toes. So this is where Kevin creates a storyline to have Chris and Nancy have an affair, right?
It was a bad idea.
Very bad idea. Oh my gosh.
It turns out that Kevin was being abusive towards Nancy in their relationship physically. And
it was not.
Kevin would always, and still, I guess, denies that any abuse ever took place in that marriage. So
she was unfortunately being domestically abused, and because she was working alongside Chris Benoit a lot,
and because of the show that Kevin Sullivan put together, where they were having a pretend affair, they actually started having a real affair. Right. So it's often said, and like people will generally say, that Kevin Sullivan booked his own divorce. Because he set up a fake story to have his wife cheat on him, and then his wife actually cheated on him with the guy that was pretending to be cheated on.
Right.
So...
But I mean, like, they were spending every waking moment together because of the storyline. So
they were filming stuff together, working together.
They were in hotels together because of the show. Yeah. And so when all this was happening with her husband, Kevin, she confided in Chris, and next thing you know, like a romance
started. Right. And it turns out...
So one day, Kevin hurt her really bad, and she calls Chris. Chris picks her up from the house, and while they're driving, Nancy calls her sister Sandra and is like, listen, I'm leaving Kevin, and I'm gonna get with Chris. So shortly after, this is where Chris and Nancy are like fully together, right? This would lead to Nancy and Kevin divorcing in 1997, as well as Chris and Martina,
his wife, divorcing.
Can you imagine?
And then shortly after, she gets engaged to Chris, and Nancy retires from her career as the original and like most iconic ballet girl.
But she's still managing other wrestlers. She's just retired from appearing.
Yes.
So while they're engaged, Nancy gives birth to her only child with Chris, named Daniel Christopher Benoit, on February 25th, 2000. And then later that year, they would officially get married in November 23rd.
So they got married in 2000.
Yes.
After they had their first child together. And everyone, including Nancy's sister, would confirm and say that Chris and Nancy were actually in love. It wasn't just a show. They fell in love together and confided in each other. So it was a true love story.
Yeah,
and
by all accounts, from what we can gather. Yeah. So just to recap, right, you know, Chris is a hardworking man who took after the Dynamite Kid, and he then ends up joining at the WCW, falls in love with Nancy, right? So towards the end of his like career in the WCW, he stated that he was unhappy, mainly because of Kevin Sullivan, right? So remember, Kevin is the head booker. Well, now he's the head booker, so he's in charge of all fights and all storylines. So you can just imagine stealing somebody's wife and marrying her. It's not gonna go good for you, buddy. So basically, one night, Chris ends up winning the WCW World Heavyweight Championship in a legitimate match. But, however, the WCW decided not to acknowledge this win, which I can just imagine.
Nope.
Chris is upset. So he's like, you know what? What am I doing here? But when one door closes, another one opens. So their competitor WWF, which is known as the
World Wrestling Federation. Now they're the WWE, but in the 90s they were the WWF.
Yeah. So they understood that Chris was a World Heavyweight Championship. So they were like, hey, listen, we recognize that you are a World Champion.
Why don't you come over here?
Yeah.
Leave that place.
So Chris is obviously like, you know what? Deuces.
You know what? I will. I will.
So he ends up leaving and he goes to the WWF. And let me tell you something. His ride or die friends, Eddie Guerrero and Dean Malenko, dipped as well. They were like...
They came with him. They were like, oh, you're ditching, I'm ditching.
Right. They're like, if the WCW is going to treat you like trash, we'll treat them like trash. And so they dipped. I love that. So after switching to the WWF, which is now known as the WWE...
He got a lot of success.
So much
He won the 2004 Royal Rumble.
Against 15 people.
So Royal Rumble is that match where people come in
is it like every
one by
minute?
one. I don't remember what the time frame is, but like people come in like every now and then, and your goal is to be the last person in the ring at the very end. So obviously
hard.
It's a really big advantage to come in really late. Like if you're the first one to come in, you're probably going to lose.
Yeah. Halfway you're just like...
Yeah, so Chris Benoit ended up winning that 2004 Royal Rumble.
The last person that came out in the Royal Rumble was Big Show.
Y'all
have seen him, right?
It's the Big Show.
He's
huge. So he beat Big Show in the Royal Rumble, and because he won Royal Rumble, he won a championship fight at WrestleMania, and WrestleMania is essentially like the Super Bowl for WWE.
Yeah. Well, not unfortunately, but fortunately, he did end up winning.
He beats him, and he wins the World Heavyweight Championship at WrestleMania. And side note, very important, his best friend, ride or die buddy, friend for life, almost like a brother to him, Eddie Guerrero, also at that same WrestleMania, he wins the WWE champ. No, sorry. He defended his WWE championship title. So there's this like photo of both of them like besties on stage, streamers, confetti coming down, both of them with their belts. Eyes. And Chris Benoit's living son, would go on to say that he wishes they would have just retired at that moment because it was a really awesome, and he didn't think they were going to be able to like top after that.
Right, because I mean, how could you? You just won the World Championship.
And your bestie has the WWE Championship. You guys have belts, everything you worked for, ahí está. Vámonos.
Right, like...
So this brings us to...
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2. Okay, so Eddie Guerrero first started wrestling in Mexico, and shortly after he would move to Japan to wrestle alongside his bestie, his now bestie, his future bestie, Chris. And this is where they would form a brotherly relationship. And reports would claim to say that Eddie started struggling with substance abuse at the very beginning of his career. So he struggled with it from the very start.
Dang.
Yeah, so while working for the WWE, Eddie was really heavily abusing drugs and alcohol, which caused him to miss a lot of work, a lot of practices for the WWE. Vicky Guerrero, his wife, Eddie's wife, would start to claim that she caught him overdosing 3 different times at their home, and that Vicky started to get kind of tired of seeing Eddie, her husband, in like this specific type of condition. And she stated that one time that she found Eddie passed out on the couch as she was taking the kids to school, and that she prayed to God and she said, "Hey God, if you're gonna take him, like just take him," because I'm like she started to get fed up and kind of tired of seeing her husband in this condition. So Eddie would enter rehab a couple times, but he would like continuously start to relapse. So Eddie would continue his substance abuse, and which led him to get fired. Right. So he gets fired for the WWE.
Pretty hardcore.
Yeah, it's pretty hardcore. And after some time, he was able to go to rehab again, but this time it actually worked. Woo! So things are looking up for Eddie. He joins back to the WWE. But this time he had to like gain back the respect of his coworkers, because
you have to.
You know, it's tough that way. And so this is where the story starts to get really, really dark. So in November of 2005, Chris, alongside with Eddie and Chavo Guerrero Jr. So if you're wondering who Chavo Guerrero Jr. is, would you like to explain that, Ashley?
Yes, he is also a fellow wrestler who was really popular around the year of 2004, 2010. And personally, he was an awesome wrestler. He wasn't like really like mainstream. He was kind of like one of those like B-list wrestlers, but he was still really good. I mean, he was part of the Guerrero. Yeah,
so dynasty. he was Eddie's nephew, and they wrestled together all the time. And I remember him a lot. And so because Eddie was really close with Chris, so Chavo essentially became like the third person in the squad. Yeah, they were like a squad together. So they were going to do a WWE event in Minneapolis. And so the hotel staff calls Chavo one morning and they're like, "Hey, something's wrong with your uncle because this man's not answering the phone. He didn't answer his wake up call," and which is weird because he was a really punctual guy.
Yeah. Always answered his phone.
And so Chavo's like, "Well, that's weird." So they go to the door. The door is like locked from the inside with like one of those chains. And they had to bust through it, and what they would find would be like pretty tragic. So Eddie is passed out on the floor of the bathroom, and they find him kind of like gurgling, making like noises, and like being unresponsive. And so tragically, at the age of 38, Eddie Guerrero would die in the arms of his nephew, Chavo Guerrero Jr.
That's so tragic.
So, and the cause of death was ruled as heart failure.
Yes.
It was kind of suspected, but like not confirmed, that he may have relapsed again from his substance abuse. But the official cause of death was just heart failure something wrong with his heart.
Because nothing was like shown in the autopsy that he abused drugs at that point.
So Chavo Guerrero, he calls Chris Benoit, and he's like, "Hey man, I need you to sit down," because he knew it was going to be hard on Chris. So he's like, "Hey man, I need you to sit down because I need to tell you something." And he would tell Chris like, "Hey, this morning Eddie died in my arms." And Chavo would say that he had never heard a grown man, especially a guy like Chris Benoit, so a couple days later they would attend Eddie's funeral. And this is crazy, but literally just a little while after they go to Eddie's funeral, the WWE guys who were there at the funeral had to fly out to Europe because they were going to do an event. So they didn't even have like proper time to grieve. And while it was hard on everybody, nobody was taking it as hard as Chris. So this is when Chris Jericho would state that no one up front could tell that Chris Jericho was suffering, but behind closed doors... Chris Benoit. But behind closed doors, Chris Benoit was like an absolute mess. Vicky, which is Eddie Guerrero's wife, would state that Chris would sometimes show up to their house and start to cry on Eddie's side of the bed. And just Nancy,
like full-blown tears.
Yeah, like he would like show up and just like lose it there on Eddie's bed. Nancy started to get like kind of concerned for Chris, And so because he wasn't able to deal with the grief of losing his friend, and so what they did was they got him a journal where he could write his feelings as if he was writing to Eddie. And so, like, long story short, like, Eddie's death played like a really important part of like Chris like having like an emotional breakdown. And the day that Eddie died, essentially, like a part of Chris died that day too.
Makes sense.
Chris Jericho, if you remember him from earlier, he stated that after Chris died, Chris Jericho's relationship with Chris Benoit would also die, because Chris started to kind of like separate himself from everybody, like kind of put up a wall. And Chris was so grief-stricken that Nancy would say to Chris that he should leave the WWE because
like officially retire.
Yeah, like he should like just leave it, because she saw what it was doing to him, and it was probably better for him to just step away so that he wouldn't be constantly reminded of losing his friend. And Nancy's sister, Sandra, would say that Chris started to like act like differently than he used to before. He started to like feel like he was being followed and like start to get really, really paranoid.
Yeah.
And so like he was like starting to get like mad at life in general and started to become like bitter. And so with Eddie's death, like Chris just like became a totally different person.
A part of him died that day.
He wasn't able to deal with like the loss of it. And so yeah, that's just a story of Eddie passing away and like what it did to Chris.
Right. And I think it plays an important part in chapter 3.
Yeah, for sure.
Chapter 3, The Crime. So up at this point, the public believes that Chris and Nancy have this like once in a lifetime type of marriage, considering that they went through so much just to be together, right? I mean, she was married before, and then they got divorced, and then they got together. However, history repeats itself. They also have domestic abuse issues, which leads Nancy to file divorce in 2003 with also a restraining order. The tea is hot,
but the coffee is cold.
So yes, fortunately for her, she got a restraining order and also filed for divorce in 2003. But Chris was like, absolutely not. I did so much to get you to marry you and have a child. I'm not losing you this way. Absolutely not. So he enlists the help of his sister-in-law, Sandra, to basically be the middleman for him, right? He's like, hey, Sandra, I need your help. Like, I want my wife back. I need my family back together. Help me. And she does. And so they end up getting together, right? And reports say that, like, once they rekindled, you know, their relationship was getting better and they were learning how to be a better husband and wife to each other. But unfortunately, the death of his best friend, Eddie, kind of put a pause on all that. Mm-hmm. So, of course, after his bestie died, that is where, oh no, things went so bad.
Yeah, this is as bad as it can get, seriously. So this is where it gets really dark, guys. So if you made it to this part and you don't want to hear the rest, you can just go ahead and watch one of our other videos.
Leave and go somewhere else, right? So this is what happens. In 2007, the WWE was scheduled to have a tour called the Texas Loop. Chris Benoit, Chavo Guerrero, and another fellow wrestler who is not really important, but I guess.
Yeah, he doesn't play a part in the story.
His name was Scott Armstrong. To be honest, I don't remember him.
Scott, if you're listening, I'm sorry. I'm not saying you're not important.
I don't remember you. I'm sorry.
Me either.
So they were supposed to travel to Laredo together as part of the tour stop, right? And then after this, they were supposed to travel to Houston together, you know, just kind of like.
Of course it happened in Texas.
Always. Freaking Texas. All right. So one day on Saturday night, Chris calls Chavo and is basically like, listen, man, I can't travel with y'all. My wife, Nancy, and my son, Daniel, have come down
Who is 7 at this time.
He's 7, exactly. They've come down with some sort of like stomach virus. I got to take him to the hospital. I won't be able to travel with you. Chavo was like, no biggie. Just remember that we have a pay-per-view match in Houston. So just, you know.
You need to make it to that. It's really important.
Right. Like, you've got commitments to the WWE. Like, please be there. Chris is like, no issues, no problem. Like, I'll see you, right? And before he gets off the phone.
And this is key.
He tells Chavo, hey, Chavo, I love you. And Chavo is like, what? I mean, like, I love you too.
He didn't find it weird, but it was weird, like, the tone he said it in. It was like
Right.
a somber thing as opposed to like, hey, man, I love you. It was more like, hey, Chavo, by the way, I love you.
Right. It was as if it was like the
Like the
last
end.
time he was going to tell him I
Yeah.
love him. And he just wanted to make sure, like, listen, come what comes, I love you, and I just want you to know that. And so Chavo was like, oh, that's kind of weird. So that same night, a couple of hours later, right, Chris starts messaging Chavo, like, weird messages. And one of the messages had said, the dogs are in the enclosed pool area and the back door is open. This is at 5:30 in the morning. And Chavo
It's like, how is that relevant to Chavo at all? He did find it really weird. It's like, what does that have to do with me?
Right. He's like, why do
such a
I
random
care that the
message.
door is open and that the doors are in the pool area? It's weird. And then 30 seconds later, the exact same message gets sent from Nancy's phone. So he got that exact same message
Twice.
from
Back to
Chris
back
and
from
Nancy.
Chris and Nancy's. Well, from their phones.
From their
But we
phones.
know that it was both messages were Chris.
Right.
Now
Chris
we
was
do.
the one that sent it, but at the time we didn't know. And so Chavo was like, you know what? I'm so tired. It's 5:30 in the morning. I'll deal with this later. Right? Because he's going to pick up Chris from the airport in the morning. So he's like,
Yeah, he's like, I'm going to see him in 3 hours, whatever.
right. No big issues. So he wakes up the following morning, has breakfast with Scott, and they travel to the next city, which is Corpus. And so when they get there, they have not heard from Chris at all. And so Chavo tells Scott, like, hey, you know, have you heard from Chris? And that's when Scott's like, yeah.
I got these weird messages.
I got this message from Chris last night. And so he was like, oh my gosh, what did it say? The exact same
The
thing.
same message.
The same message. And Chavo was like, wait, why would he message you and me the same thing? Like,
Something's weird here.
something's up. So that same day, one of the representatives from the WWE calls Chavo and he's like, hey, come over here. So he goes over, right? And he's like, where is Chris? And Chavo was like, listen, man, I haven't heard from him. Neither has Scott.
Nothing.
I don't know what's up. And the representative is like, why wouldn't you tell us that you haven't heard from him? Like,
We have a pay-per-view event. First of all, that's all they cared about was running their pay-per-view event.
Right.
So
a man potentially is missing, but all you care about is a wrestling match. Get your priorities together. But apparently, they didn't. So Chavo was like, listen, man, like, I was trying to cover for my friend, you know, like, I don't want him to get fired or suspended. So I was just trying to cover for him. And the representative was like, okay, listen, at this point, like, we haven't heard from him in a while. So let's go ahead and do a wellness check. So Vince McMahon, this is basically the CEO of WWE, calls the police and is like, listen, I need a wellness check on one of my wrestlers, Chris Benoit. And so the police go over to his house and they didn't think anything of it. They're just gonna go see if everyone's okay. They arrive on June 25th, 2007 at 11:45 and notice that every single one in the house, 1, 2, 3, is deceased. They don't know what happened. And because of that, they call Vince and they're like, listen, man, we just showed up and like they're all dead. At this point, Vince has no idea the details. All he knows,
details yet.
right? All he knows is that his wrestler and his family are dead. So he calls an emergency meeting with the WWE. He sits down all the wrestlers, all the employees, and just lays down the hardcore facts that Chris is dead, and so is Nancy and Daniel. And everyone in the arena is just wailing, crying, because it's like, we just lost Eddie in 2006, and now we're losing Chris Benoit in 2007. What is going on? And so that night, they were scheduled to have a pay-per-view match and you name it. But Vince is like, absolutely not. He cancels the whole thing. And for 3 hours...
In an empty arena.
In an empty arena, which was sold out.
It was sold out.
He decides to do a 3-hour special tribute to Chris Benoit because he was such an inspiration to so many wrestlers. He was a hard worker. They thought he was a hard worker dedicated to the WWE. And they just felt, listen, this is the least that we can do for him is just show tribute to him. So they do. But, of course...
When the details start leaking, that's, I mean...
Backpedal. Right. So, what we come to find out is that the police enter the home and first find... Viewer discretion is advised. They find Daniel face down in his bed.
He's only 7.
He's only 7. And he was strangled to death. And near his body was a Bible that was placed right next to his head.
Oh, so I just want to point out really quickly that at the time, Chris Benoit was not a religious man, but Eddie Guerrero was. And
I believe he was Catholic.
Yeah, I think so too. Which would make sense. I mean, he's Mexican, right?
Yeah.
So he would preach to Chris about God, and so Chris was like starting to get on board with
like
that
almost
too.
converted in a way. So
go on. Sorry.
When he
That's that's the placement of the Bible.
Yeah. So when he killed his son, he placed the Bible near his head.
I mean, it doesn't. I mean, he killed him.
It doesn't help the fact, but I don't know what he was thinking at the moment. But yeah. So after they find Daniel face down in the bed, strangled, they move on over to the family room, and they noticed Nancy is also
his wife.
His wife is also face down, but she was actually bound from her feet and legs, and she was duct taped in her mouth. She was also strangled, and just like Daniel, she had a Bible placed next to her head.
And finally, who would they find?
Yes, they make their way down to the gym basement, and they find Chris Benoit hanging from the cable tire of his lateral pull-down machine. So it said that he had a 240 pound, like, the weight, and he released it, and then all that happened.
Yeah, if you guys have seen like a lat pull-down machine, it's the one where you yank the stuff down. So essentially he wrapped around his neck, put the weight at the max weight, and then released it from his neck. So he hung himself.
So at this point, the police are like, something's up. Like, this does not seem like your typical homicide. It seems like there's something more.
Foul play.
Very suspicious foul play. And not only that, the cops also saw that there was beer cans all around the house, and they thought that, okay, maybe Chris was like drunk and just had like some sort of break, something like that. So upon further investigation, that's when police realized that this is a double murder/suicide.
Murder-suicide.
Yeah, and that Chris is responsible for this.
Completely responsible for it. Yeah. That's it.
At this point, they don't know why, though. They just know that he killed 2 of his family members and himself, and they're trying to put the pieces together. Matthew Randazzo Fifth. If I butcher his last name,
sorry,
I'm
Matthew,
so sorry.
if you're watching.
He's the author of The Ring of Hell. So basically,
it's a book about the Chris Benoit murders.
Yeah, and he goes into detail about like what happened. So basically, picture it. Friday evening, Chris and Nancy had a physical altercation, unfortunately, which resulted in Chris restraining Nancy with duct tape and strangling her with the telephone cord, and then places the Bible near her head. That is just intense.
Yeah.
So she dies, supposedly, Friday evening. Then he goes to sleep. Wakes up Saturday morning, and it is believed that Chris gives his son Daniel Xanax and basically
that's just a speculation.
It's a speculation.
That's a speculation.
Yeah. But the speculation is that he gives his son Xanax, drugs him, and then proceeds to strangle him and places him in the bed with a Bible near his head.
Gross.
Very gross. And as a mom, like,
yeah, we're parents.
That really triggers me.
That's too much, man.
But that's basically what happened. And then he went basically the whole day, right? All Saturday with his wife dead.
His wife is dead and his son is dead. And he still goes about his day.
Yeah, we don't know the state of we don't know if he was like happy, sad. I don't know. We don't know, right? Like, we just don't know. But what we do know is that the day that he called Chavo, do y'all remember when he was like, hey, my wife and son,
sick. Their stomach hurts.
The entire time they were dead. The entire time. That's the chilling part, because it's like...
It's like he killed them and then still had the
guts to lie and say that they were sick.
Oh, they're sick. Yeah, they're fine. They'll be fine.
No. I absolutely hate it.
Yeah.
So he basically lies and says that they're fine. So he makes that call Saturday evening, remember? And after that call is placed, that's when he heads up to his like family media room and he does 2 Google searches. The first search is the prophet Elijah and the story of the resurrection of a little boy. I guess
so. It was like to give himself peace of mind, like, oh, I killed my son, but he's gonna be resurrected back
and go with the Lord. I don't know.
I mean, you killed your son.
I don't like that.
That's
but
crazy.
Okay.
What was the second Google search?
And the second Google search is gonna blow your mind. Basically, it was a Google search on how to snap one's neck the easiest and painless way possible. Bro. So he searches it, and that is why he goes to the gym basement. You know what I'm saying?
And he hangs himself.
He hangs himself. So how he does it is he gets a towel, he wraps it around his neck, then gets the cable tie from the lateral pull down machine, wraps it around the towel, puts it at the maximum weight, which is 250 pounds, and releases it, and you know the rest. Yeah. So police go into the home, they see all this and that, right? And then they notice that Chris left somewhat of a suicide note in the Bible that basically said, I'm preparing to leave this earth.
It's getting cold in here. Okay, so steroid rage or CTE, chapter 4.
You tell me.
Now, before we get into this next segment, we want to point out that we are in no way, and let me make this clear for the people that are listening, we are in no way trying to justify a murderer. Right. Because Chris Benoit, regardless of anything that we're about to go over, he did kill his family, and that's a fact, and that's something that we cannot change. So I'm not trying to say, oh yeah, he killed his family, but this, it was because of XYZ. because of this. No.
He did what he did. And
he did what he did, and he knew what he was doing. He killed his family, he killed his wife, he killed his son. So that being said, so you guys don't come for me in the comment sections, let's go ahead and get into this. So the speculation that was being thrown around in terms of an answer to why this happened was they called it perhaps a case of roid rage, which is, steroids. Based on steroids. Yeah. It was alleged and said that Chris wasn't all out of steroids. And Matthew, the author of that book we were talking about, Ring of Hell, said that Chris began to use his steroids as soon as they were in high school, because he was essentially a smaller wrestler and all the bigger guys would get like the fame and fortune.
More screen time. So
yeah, it was like,
oh, let me take steroids.
He was like, you know what? I'm going to bulk up with these steroids, man. Yeah, I'm all about the roids. So there's a WWE drug enforcement policy that existed. I'm sure it still exists.
The wellness policy.
Exactly.
Program.
Yes. So it was said that it was Nancy said that. So the WWE had created a drug enforcement policy and a wellness program that was designed to it was like to test wrestlers, like, yo, what type of drugs are you using?
Right,
recreational drugs,
steroids,
the devil's lettuce, that kind of stuff. But Nancy told Chris that she believed that this program was a joke because they allowed him to wrestle even though he was using steroids.
Right, and from what we know, he passed every single test.
So it's like, hold on, how did he pass tests if they knew he was taking roids?
Right.
Like, roids? Did I just call it roids?
Yeah, you did. But
so
like,
they knew he was using roids, but he was still getting away with it.
Yeah.
But it was probably one of those things where it's like, well, we can't have this guy miss out. He's one of our stars.
One of our main stars, and we just can't have him sit out for like 2 weeks or whatever.
So in Chris's autopsy, they found out that he had an insane, and when I say insane, I mean insane amount of testosterone. And so Chris Nowinski, who was a former, this is where we're about to go into CTE. And for those of you guys that don't know what CTE is, it's like, it happens to your brain. It's essentially like brain damage from a consistent, repeated amount of concussions that are happening to you.
That Chris Nowinski guy, he was a former wrestler, but now he's a neuroscientist.
Glow up, right? WWE wrestler to neuroscientist. Dang, man.
He runs the Concussion Legacy Foundation. And so basically he wrote a book on CTE. And CTE is chronic traumatic. Oh, man.
For all you doctors that are watching, I'm sorry, but I think it's chronic traumatic
encephalopathy? I butchered that.
Velociraptor? What?
I don't know.
Chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Encephalopathy. There
Something like that.
CTE. It's called CTE, Boom. Guys. That's it. You don't have to. We're not doctors.
We're not doctors. He's an engineer and I'm a psychologist.
So
I don't know. But basically, anyways. CTE is a progressive degenerative brain damage or brain disease. Sorry. And it starts with severe hits to the head. That's what we know. So
long story short, CTE, concussions, they all work together. It's like damage that gets done to your brain from repeated blows to the head.
As far as we know, Chris stated that there was 4 cases of CTE found in the NFL. Because the NFL is like hitting each other constantly. So 2 of them committed suicide, and 1 of them led cops in a deadly high-speed chase because he was hearing voices in his head. So CTE is major. It's something you should take seriously. So continue.
So after the murders were committed and they started finding out more information, Chris Nowinski reached out to Chris's dad, and basically he's like, hey man,
I suspect
that your son had CTE.
Yeah.
Because of all the, I mean, they used to take chairs to the head, that kind of stuff. So
right, yeah, because Chris Jericho said they took massive head
Exactly.
shots, steel chairs to the head in the 90s. Like, I mean, full force.
Bam, bas, boo, ba.
And Chris, actually, Nowinski, he had to retire early because he had so many concussions. He was
Right.
just like, I'm out.
So he asked for permission to do a test on Chris Benoit's brain to see if he had CTE. Chris Nowinski would discover that Chris Benoit indeed had a really severe case of CTE, and they found a massive amount of the, and again, I'm not a doctor, but they found a massive amount of the tau protein
Yes, correct.
in Chris's brain. And tau protein is a marker for brain damage.
Oh my gosh.
Brain damage. So because of this severe CTE that Chris had on his brain,
It influenced, well, it
he
said
could have definitely had some influences.
it said it influences their emotional behavior. So take that with what you may.
Right. So Vicky recalls Eddie and Chris, like as we were talking about a little while ago, they were taking a lot of chair shots and steel chairs to the head, and when they would get a concussion, Chris Jericho would state that if they were to get a concussion, that the WWE was just kind of like, whatever, like
brush it off.
Like, and that's what they did back then. Times were different. I mean, I know now, like, times are super different. Like now there's so many protocols and concussion protocols that they take, like in the NFL and stuff. So
But at the
it was
time,
different back then.
At the time, they were like, listen, I'm not going to say I have a concussion because I'm probably going to sit out for 2 weeks. And that means 2 weeks of no screen time, which means 2 weeks of somebody filling my spot.
And then you could lose your spot.
Right. And you don't want that because your money's gone. Like, bro.
So this is where we tie back into Chris Benoit's signature move when he would jump off the rope
Super
and just
important.
smash his head into people. The flying headbutt. So Harley Race would invent this move called the flying headbutt. And he literally, the inventor of the move, said, guys,
Caution.
do not, whatever you do not use this move because it's gonna cause some serious spine damage. But what happens?
He ends up in a
what does he end up in?
He ends up in a wheelchair.
No manches, bro. So Dynamite Kid, remember from the beginning, who was Chris's inspiration to wrestle, he took up on that move on the flying headbutt. And he doesn't care about the fact that the other guy ended up in a wheelchair, and he still takes up the signature move.
And he also ends up in a wheelchair.
Nah, hombre, sir. So the Dynamite Kid, who was Chris Benoit's inspiration, and who inspired him to do the move, literally told everybody, guys, do not do this move. But what does Chris Jericho do? Sorry, not Chris Jericho. So many Chris's. What does Chris Benoit do? He takes up the move anyways. He's like, I don't care, bro. So why wasn't the WWE, and this is where it gets juicy, why wasn't the WWE doing something to stop them from doing this move that they knew was bad?
Right, because they had 2 wrestlers previously who did that move and ends up in a wheelchair. And the third person who does it ends up losing his mind and committing murder and suicide.
Again, we're not blaming the murders on CTE because I'm sure other people have had CTE who don't kill their families. So this goes ahead and brings us over to Chapter 5, Cover Up. This is about the WWE and their attempt, actually pretty successful attempt to like erase Chris Benoit from all WWE history books, videos, all that stuff. You will not find him on the WWE website anywhere.
So as we know, when they first found out that Chris and his family died, Vince McMahon, did a whole 3-hour tribute for Chris. But once everything came to light, that's when Vince McMahon came on air like a couple days later and was like, listen, now that we know the full details of what happened, I'm going to be the only one who releases a statement, and we will not mention Chris Benoit in tonight's taping, nor will you ever hear mention his name ever again. Not only that, after that, public statement was released, Vince McMahon would then call again another meeting with all of his employees and wrestlers and basically say, like, listen, you are not allowed to talk about Chris Benoit in any interviews or just basically with anybody. Like, if you want to keep your job, keep your lips zipped, basically. You cannot find any mention of Chris Benoit whatsoever in the WWE. And it's kind of sad to say because in 2006, Eddie Guerrero passes away, right? And then shortly after, they induct him into the Hall of Fame. And a lot of people were like, okay, that's great, that's awesome. But then the following year when Chris Benoit dies, a lot of people were like, all right, so is he also going to get inducted into the Hall of Fame? Like, what's going on? But this is where Jim Ross, one of the commentators for the WWE, do you remember him?
Yes, the guy that
talked like this. Yeah, he came out and he was like, no, I don't think it's right for him to be inducted in the Hall of Fame because we don't want to, like, humanize a murderer. Like, yes, he gave so much to the company and he inspired so many wrestlers, but like...
And you know what? I actually kind of agree with him though, because regardless of everything, yeah, he gave a lot to the sport, he gave a lot to this, he gave a lot to that, but just don't kill your family. It almost feels like what they're doing is an attempt to erase him so that they don't get associated with the fact that they didn't care enough about abuse or like CTE and like what they were doing to like protect their
right, because for instance,
protect their wrestlers.
His signature move, the flying headbutt, it should have been illegal. After the first two wrestlers came out in wheelchairs, it should have been illegal right there, but they didn't do anything about it, right? So there was that. And then it was the fact that Eddie Guerrero passes away, and that same day he's on a plane flying to Europe. First of all, that event should have been canceled.
Yeah.
Or at least Chris should have been given like, hey,
not within a few hours, man. That's not enough time.
No. Like, your best friend just dies and you're gonna go wrestle. Like, you're not even in the right state of mind. Nope. So the WWE either should have canceled it or told Chris, hey, take a month off. Like, just, you need to grieve. But they didn't. And it's like, what the heck, man? Like, I understand he's making you money and bringing you fans, but his best friend just passed away. What is wrong with you? Why did something so tragic have to happen in order for them to like, oh my gosh?
This happens a lot in like a lot of stuff where it's like the worst thing has to happen for any action to take place. And tragically, very, very tragically, I mean, a woman and a 7-year-old child had to lose their lives for them to even attempt basically to do anything. So let's go ahead and get into our conclusion. So to wrap up the video.
Oh snap! Put in the plug.
We do not in any way condone or accept that it's okay for what he did, but it is kind of important to point out that the WWE maybe could have done something better.
For sure.
And another thing is, and this is going to be for episode 2, just like a sort of lead in, but the WWE has a history of doing things that are very, very questionable, as I'm sure many like major sports leagues will tend to do because they don't want to ruin their name. But
they
just
tend
as a
to
preview,
sweep a lot
for sure. To sort of like preview into next week's video on this wrapped up podcast, we're going to be talking about the story of Owen Hart and how the WWE was savage in what happened to him. Yes. And so in conclusion,
it was really tragic.
It's just a really sad story. Chris Benoit, he is a family murderer. He killed his wife. He killed his son, and then he killed himself, which is honestly the most coward way you can go out.
Right.
It's like you killed 2 people, and then you just take the cheap way out.
Of course, I don't want anybody to die, but I mean, if he was really like, listen, I don't want to be in this world anymore, he should have just himself, but left his wife and his son still alive. Right?
I don't know. There's no reason. Like, the victims for sure in the story
nothing to do with it.
Are Nancy and his son Daniel. So that wraps up that story. And if you guys have any stories that you guys want us to talk about, we don't want to delve into like mainstream stories like, oh, you guys should talk about Jeffrey Dahmer, you guys should talk about Ted Bundy,
Ed Gein.
No, there's literally documentaries and movies and actors' portrayals and all this stuff on them.
We want to talk about like stuff that people don't know, like this story. Like, how many people know about this story?
I had no idea this story even happened, and that's because I was into the WWE at this time. Another thing is, we also want to talk about stories that matter to us. Like, I don't want to talk about some like random person that I don't care about personally, or like, you know what I mean, like the story that I'm not personally invested in.
Right, like this one we were invested in it because we watched
both
wrestling
liked the
growing up,
WWE.
and we were just like,
we were super into it.
Yeah.
DX, D-Generation for life. So yeah.
So if you have any recommendations of like something that you want us to talk about, let us know and we'll do our research, see if we can find anything, and we'll bring it to you guys.
And so chapter 2 of Wrapped Up is going to be the story of Owen Hart, and that's a preview for next week.
Yes. So if you guys are excited, get excited with us. And for next time, you know, bring your blankets, bring your snacks, and
we are sorry if this was a little bit rough, but this was our first.
Yeah.
This is our first video of this kind. So if you guys want to, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe. We have plenty more Wrapped Up episodes coming up.
Yes.
Thank you guys for watching.
We love y'all. Y'all are amazing.
Well, we like you, but take us to dinner first.
Okay, yes.
Yes, love is a strong word.
But don't forget, we're also going to do the other...
No, you know what? We love you guys.
Videos. Yeah, we love you guys. Like, seriously.
And our channel's not going to change to purely these types of videos.
No.
Our channel is literally about whatever we feel like it. I mean, like, the only reason we did this was because of the mics. So we were like, man, these mics sound
we
good.
were like, yo, we got to do something.
So we got to do something when we talk. So I hope you guys enjoyed the story. I'm sorry that it was such a tragic and sad story, but true crime stories always are. There's always
also,
victims.
Sorry that this video is so long.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So if this is too long for you guys, just, you know, drop your comments, your genuine comments down below.
Your feedback.
Yeah, this is our first time delving into something like of this type. So yeah, we were really excited about it, and this was a good story. And yeah, subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Owen Hart coming up.